I share the concern of my colleagues about the fact that the price now is below the European average, and you might elaborate on that again. One of the things I think that made pig farmers fit to cope and fit to deal with volatility was what they call it, as we know, economies of scale. And would you be your view that if we reduce the herds by 10%, that they will lose that economies of scale? And you might comment on that. The capacity question, my understanding from some primary producers is that they were finding it hard to get their pigs processed for a good part of this year at various stages. Could you explain, had you problems with capacity, with your staffing, with whatever at different points? And if not, why am I hearing that? But I did hear that. And I'm interested in that point about the markets. When do you see the markets expanding? When do you see an expansion of the markets, and where? And could you put a time frame? And the very last thing, and thanks, Gerald, the very end thing is, it would seem to me to make no sense that we wouldn't support the sector if you guys are fit to tell us, and the IFA before you, that there are pending markets and improvements. Surely it's important to tide the sector over to reach that point. But maybe it's very important that that go out into the news, that there is that potential. Thanks.
Okay. Philip O'Connor.
Start with something, and Alex might follow on then, Chairman. Firstly, to Senator Daly, I mean, you talked about the EU average price and the gap, and I think Senator O'Reilly has referenced it as well. I mean, and I think it's just a point of timing as much as anything. Like, we've come through a period, like I said earlier, where the sector here, the processing sector here, was paying a price well above what any competitors were paying, and there was a support level too. Producers, as I've said, I mean, we have gone through the last 12 months where the Irish price paid to Irish producers was above what was being paid by our competitors, was above of them. Only in the last 3-4 weeks have prices started to rise in the EU, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Spain. Only in those last few weeks have they started to put some, increase price to producers, and that will hopefully drive on the European market, and we will avail of that. I mean, the price lift that has come, I would think, and I mean, I'm not party to all aspects of the business, but I mean, the price increase in recent times was largely, I would say, driven by work with the Irish market, the domestic scene, with retailers domestically, with secondary processors. A lot of our product goes to secondary processing, so it was engagement and a push to increase prices through the chain there that allowed for an increase, and there will be follow-on. But we are not influencers either of the market, as we said, in terms of our scale of production being just less than 1.5% of the EU. And there is significant resistance everywhere to trying to get price increase. If you look at, and I did yesterday in the context of this, at the consumer price index figures, I mean, the 12-month figures to March are still just showing a 3% increase in meat overall. Now, we know that across other sectors, there's been significant increases, be it beef, lamb, etc. There have been significant price increases in terms of raw material, but overall meat inflation thus far up to March of this year it was only at 3%, and I think if I look at those figures, the pork element was even a reduction on the 12-month period. So yes, Deputy, I mean, there is a lot of resistance, I mean, to price increases, and obviously, if you were to try and extract all of the kind of price that's needed here now to go back to producers from the domestic market, you would see some serious inflation in the Irish markets. But we have to look at export markets and international markets, and it takes just a bit more time for that rising tide to come through and deliver it. But the view is that with the inflation that has taken place in the cost of production across the board, both in Europe, in Ireland, and elsewhere, it is going to have to drive prices everywhere, and then we get to, benefit from an increased return from the market. And in terms of volume, in various, the question was asked around whether you have issues supply contracts, etc. And I think Senator O'Reilly also talked about the impact of a 10% reduction in output here. So at the moment, I mean, I think what that 10% reduction would do is to undermine the efficiency of individual pig farms and pig units. I mean, if somebody is trying to stay in this business, the last thing they want to be doing is adding to their overhead. I mean, putting 90% less product through and adding to their overhead. So I think it will have an efficiency impact on them, and therefore wouldn't be something that we're at all supportive of. And also, it's as we said at the beginning, it's completely meaningless in terms of the impact, or thinking that it will have any impact on European or global markets. It makes no sense. I might hand over to you, Chairman, for Deputy Collins, some questions.
Yeah, and I might just comment on some of the things you said, Cormac. Yeah, Deputy Collins, you raised the issue around paying into a levy, perhaps in some way that the processing sector might contribute to that. That, in terms of the scheme that was put forward by you know, the IFA and ourselves and the millers, first of all, that wasn't one of the objectives of that scheme. What the producers through the IFA wanted to do was establish a levy that would trigger an investment by the state comparable to the value of the levy, which would be repaid over a period of 14 years, and that the total value of that fund, 100 million, would be set out up front by government initially, with a view to having 50% of that repaid. Now, the core responsibility of processors in the chain, given that the value of that levy would be returned to the primary producer, the core responsibility of the processors right across this, and I know Deputy O'Reilly mentioned this issue as well, is delivering the best possible market price. And I know Deputy Collins referred to that also in the context of the 20-cent increase that was introduced quite recently. And the same applies to that. If you look back over the last period, say to February 21, Ireland, given that we have 1.5% of the output at EU level, has delivered the best price over that period consistently, week after week, month after month. And only in a very short period, a very narrow window, in the last few weeks, has that price been exceeded at European level. So what we have actually done is narrowed that gap as well. And given all of the complexities of trade and given all of the additional costs that we face, and given the fact that we don't have an internal market that has scale, bearing in mind 1.5% of the EU market, 30% of that goes on the Irish market, we have very little influence on the market. But the influence you have is to pressurise as much as you can to get a better return from the secondary sector, from the retail sector, etc. But that in itself will only deliver a portion of that gap in between. And there has been a little bit of a focus in some of the discussion around that price and the price that has been paid, whereas the reality, and it evolved in the discussion, paying a price at 170 was a substantial price to be paid in the pig meat market until we arrived at the situation where we had a massive increase in the input cost at farm level. And that response then needs to come from the market, but it'll only come from the European market. It's not going to come in a decisive way from what is delivered on the Irish market by higher value contracts from secondary processors, from retailers. It'll only come from the European market. And that is beginning to be delivered, but we have to see where that lands. And Cormac has given you an indication of where that might need to land in order to meet those additional costs that primary producers are facing. On the other issue around the 10% reduction, which Deputy Collins, I think, may have mentioned, Deputy O'Reilly certainly has, is I think the key issues that we've spoken about there is, where does it make sense at any scale to introduce that type of reduction, given the scale of operation that we have at the moment, 300,000 tonnes against 23 million tonnes. If we're not careful, we'll get our industry swallowed up by the might of the European industry. And picking up 300,000 tonnes is not significant if you're already producing 23 million tonnes. So we have to be careful that we don't reduce our competitiveness base further than the way in which it has currently been eroded by the high input prices. And bearing in mind that we cannot capture the value of that erosion in input costs from our domestic market. That is a massive challenge. So if there is a provision in the conditionality around the fund that is now about to be announced, it cannot include that provision because it simply makes no sense at any level at all. And all it simply does is it deprives those that are producing efficiently from and makes them produce inefficiently. I don't know if there are any other questions that.
I think
there was a question again about capacity in the earlier part of this year, Senator Riley. Yeah, I mean, I think, like as I said, the industry here has invested and built up its capacity as the sector and as farmers have invested and increased output. What can happen at times is when there's a short, kind of almost unannounced or unexpected change in flow. And certainly, last year and perhaps into this year, pigs going to Northern Ireland, maybe weren't all of them weren't getting up there. And that largely, I think, is down to, okay, there were perhaps processing issues in Northern Ireland, but their domestic production has increased, and that was given priority. The industry here has, we've as I said, 5% increase in slaughterings last year, probably 1.5–2% this year. So it's getting through them. I mean, there's things, simple things. You can have an additional bank holiday, and it's a day out of production. That's probably 14,000 pigs. Suddenly, that list of producers are back, for another week or whatever. Things like that can happen, but it's short-term changes in supply can have some issue, whereas the longer term development and growth certainly will be met by the capacity and the investment.